Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely wild. We're going to look at one of biology's most astonishing mysteries: how living systems manage to pull incredibly weak, almost imperceptible signals out of an overwhelming sea of environmental noise. It's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack, except the haystack is screaming at you.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture a pit viper hunting at night. It is pitch black, zero visibility. Yet this snake can detect, track, and strike a tiny warm-blooded mouse from up to a full meter away, completely in the dark. How on earth does a snake essentially see heat? Honestly, it sounds like an impossible biological feat, and it's a puzzle that researchers have been trying to decode for decades.
To unpack how the snake actually pulls this off, we're going to follow a quick agenda. First, we'll look at the pit viper's superpower, followed by the noisy sensor paradox. From there, we'll explore amplification via dynamical bifurcation. After that, we'll cover the self-tuning feedback loop, and finally, a universal biological blueprint. Don't worry, we are going on a very structured journey here, starting from macrobiology, zooming down into microbiophysics, and then pulling right back out to universal design principles.
All right, Section 1, the pit viper's superpower. Let's talk about the facial pit organ, which functions almost like a pinhole camera for thermal imaging.
Right near the viper's nostril is this small facial opening called the pit organ, and it is packed with thousands of sensory nerve fibers. Now, careful experiments have shown that these single nerve fibers can reliably respond to a microscopic temperature increase of just 1 millikelvin. Let me repeat that, 1 millikelvin. That is 1/1000th of a single degree. It's an absolutely astonishing level of sensitivity, perfectly allowing the snake to pick up on the tiny, distant radiant heat emitted by its prey.
Which brings us to Section 2, the noisy sensor paradox. Let's zoom in on the actual sensors inside this organ, the TRPA1 ion channels. And here is where we hit a massive biological mystery. We just learned the nerve fiber as a whole can detect a 1 millikelvin change, right? But the individual thermosensitive proteins acting as the actual sensors inside those fibers, the TRPA1 ion channels, well, they're basically 3 orders of magnitude less sensitive. They actually require 1000 millikelvin, or 1 full Kelvin shift in temperature to fully activate. So if the temperature changes by just 1 millikelvin, a single TRPA1 channel only changes its probability of opening by a measly 0.1%. You know, relying on a single TRPA1 channel is kind of like trying to hear someone whisper in a chaotic, noisy crowd. Because of all the inherent biological noise and thermal fluctuations down at that microscopic scale, one single channel gives you virtually zero useful information. To get an accurate 1 millikelvin reading, researchers calculate that the snake's nerve has to somehow integrate and average out over 1 million independent, incredibly noisy channel events, all within milliseconds. So how does the nerve fiber manage to amplify that tiny whisper over the roar of the crowd?
Well, the answer lies in Section 3, amplification via dynamical bifurcation. Let's break down the elegant biophysics solution to this paradox. So, the absolutely crucial thing to know here is that these TRPA1 channels are sensitive to both temperature and voltage. Let's strip away the heavy math and just step through how this creates a powerful positive feedback loop. Step 1, a tiny temperature trigger causes just a few of these channels to open up, letting a small influx of positively charged ions, or cations, into the cell. Step 2. This inward electrical current raises the voltage across the cell membrane, which is a process called depolarization. And then step 3, because the channels are also voltage sensitive, this sudden change in membrane voltage physically forces even more channels to open, creating a rapid runaway avalanche effect. This positive feedback pushes the nerve fiber toward what physicists call a dynamical bifurcation. Now, I know that sounds like intense physics jargon, but simply put, it's just a critical threshold. It's the precise tipping point where a system transitions abruptly from a regime of irregular, infrequent noise to a regime of regular, highly amplified signals. Think back to our noisy crowd analogy. A dynamical bifurcation is basically that exact moment when a disorganized, chaotic crowd suddenly unites into a booming, rhythmic stadium chant.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how clearly it contrasts these two states. Look at the purple zone over on the left. That's the irregular regime, where temperatures are lower and the nerve cell just spits out a noisy, flatline rate of random electrical blips. But the second the temperature slightly increases and crosses that dotted line into the blue zone, bam! We hit the bifurcation point. Suddenly, the firing rate becomes incredibly regular and shoots upward in a steep, explosive curve.
By hovering right near this exact bifurcation point, the slope of that response curve is almost infinitely steep. A tiny, microscopic fraction of a degree change in temperature causes a massive, immediate spike in the nerve's firing rate. The snake is essentially exploiting the physics of this critical threshold to achieve a literal 1,000-fold signal amplification. It perfectly translates a tiny 1 millikelvin hint of a mouse into rapid-fire electrical action potentials that instantly alert the snake's brain.
But wait, there's a complication. Section 4, the self-tuning feedback loop. We have to talk about the environment.
Here's the thing. Pit vipers are cold-blooded animals, and they live in extreme environments like deserts. The ambient background temperature out there fluctuates wildly, dropping drastically at night and spiking during the day. This massive environmental swing should completely ruin this delicate biological tuning. If the snake's body gets cold, the nerve fibers should technically be pushed way back into that flat, purple, noisy zone, miles away from that hypersensitive bifurcation point. So how does it stay precisely on the edge of the knife? And this brilliantly illustrates the solution, an active, self-tuning feedback loop. Check out how the rapid spike of action potentials on the left actually triggers a biochemical response that slowly returns the baseline back to normal on the right. The physical firing of the nerve itself feeds directly back into the control mechanics of the cell. Every time the nerve fires rapidly because the ambient temperature warmed up, it actively self-corrects its baseline voltage. This constant negative feedback loop actively stabilizes the snake, keeping its nerve fibers continuously poised in that hypersensitive sweet spot, no matter how wildly the background desert heat fluctuates.
This brings us to Section 5, a universal biological blueprint. Because nature doesn't just use a trick like this once. This amazing feat of biophysics isn't just an isolated evolutionary trick used by pit vipers. Other incredibly sensitive biological systems use this exact same blueprint, poising themselves at a dynamical critical point to separate faint signals from massive environmental noise. For example, E. coli bacteria. They have to navigate huge variations in background environments, yet they can detect just a 1 to 10% change in chemical concentrations to climb shallow nutrient gradients. Oh, and right now, inside your own head, the incredibly faint mechanical vibrations of sound in a quiet room are actively amplified by your inner ear using a very similar dynamical mechanism tuned dangerously close to a bifurcation point.
It is honestly awe-inspiring how biological life operates at the absolute limits of physical laws. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to ponder. Is the line between complex physics and biological evolution just an illusion? When survival is on the line, life inherently acts as a master physicist, exploiting the deepest mathematics of the universe just to catch a meal in the dark. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep asking questions.